The auctioneer's voice was a rhythmic, hypnotic drone, a sound as much a part of the Midwestern landscape as the rustle of dry cornstalks in an October wind. It was late 1969, and the air held the sharp, clean bite of coming winter. Dust motes, kicked up by hundreds of scuffed work boots, danced in the slanted afternoon sun that cut through the open doors of the county equipment barn. This was where farms came to die, their iron skeletons picked clean by neighbors and strangers alike. Silas Blackwood stood near the back, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a worn canvas jacket. He was a man built of straight lines and hard angles, his face already etched with the kind of lines that came not from smiling, but from squinting against the sun and the future. His father had been buried just 2 months prior, leaving him with 320 acres of decent bottomland, a mountain of quiet grief and a collection of debts that whispered to him in the dead of night. The auctioneer, a portly man named Henderson, with a voice like gravel in a rock tumbler, was working his way through the smaller lots. Tool chests, welding rigs, a tired-looking Ford 8N tractor that went for a song to a young man with more hope than sense. Silas paid it no mind. His eyes were fixed on the behemoth sitting silent in the corner, a hulking mass of faded yellow steel that the other farmers gave a wide berth, as if it were radioactive. It was an Alice Chalmers HD-11 crawler tractor, a bulldozer. It wasn't just old, it was ancient, a relic from the late 50s. 10 tons of pure, unadulterated iron. Its tracks were caked with the mud of a dozen different counties, the paint blistered and peeling, revealing patches of rust the color of dried blood. The big 6-cylinder diesel engine sat exposed, a greasy, complicated heart of steel and hoses. The blade out front was a foot thick at its core, its cutting edge worn and scarred from a lifetime of arguing with the earth. It was ugly, inefficient, and reeked of stale diesel and hydraulic fluid. And Silas had to have it. "All right, boys, settle down now," Henderson bellowed, gesturing toward the dozer. "Here we have a real piece of history, an AC HD-11. She ain't pretty, but the engine turns over. We got her running this morning for about a minute. Smokes a bit, but what old diesel doesn't? Who'll start the bidding for me at $500? $500 to get this old girl a new home?" A low chuckle rippled through the crowd. $500 was scrap price. The cost of hauling it away would be nearly that much. From the front of the crowd, a voice cut through the murmuring. "You ought to pay someone $500 just to drag that heap to the smelter, Henderson." The voice belonged to Warren Slater. Slater was everything Silas was not. He was round where Silas was lean, loud where Silas was quiet. He'd inherited his father's farm 10 years ago and had immediately mortgaged it to the hilt, buying the newest, biggest, and brightest machinery the John Deere dealership would sell him. His fields were immaculate, his yields were the talk of the county, and his line of credit at the bank was legendary. He stood there now, arms crossed over his plaid shirt, a smirk playing on his lips. Henderson, ever the showman, laughed it off. "Now, Warren, be nice. There's life in her yet. Who'll give me $500? Silence. The farmers looked at the dozer, then at each other, shaking their heads. It was a relic. In an age where new tractors came with enclosed cabs and radios, this open-station beast, with its clanking steel tracks, was a dinosaur. $400 then, Henderson pleaded. $400 for 10 tons of American iron. Silas felt his heart thumping against his ribs. He'd counted out the cash in his pocket a dozen times. It was almost everything he had left after paying the funeral expenses. It was a fool's gamble. His father's voice echoed in his memory, a constant refrain of, "Don't buy trouble, son. There's enough of it finds you on its own." But Silas had walked the farm for weeks, seeing not the rows of corn his father had seen, but the land beneath it. He saw the way the creek flooded the lower 20 every spring, turning prime soil into a useless swamp. He saw the 60-acre woodlot on the north end, full of scrub oak and granite fieldstones the size of coffins, land that had never seen a plough. The farm wasn't failing because his father was a bad farmer. It was failing because it was only half a farm. The other half was waiting to be wrestled from nature, and that kind of wrestling match required muscle. 10 tons of it. 300. Henderson's voice was getting desperate. Silas took a deep breath, the dusty air scratching his throat. He raised a hand, just a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Henderson's eyes locked onto him. "I've got 300 from Mr. Blackwood, $300. Do I hear 4? 400. Slater turned, his eyes finding Silas in the back. The smirk widened into a look of genuine pity. "Blackwood, what in God's name are you going to do with that thing? Anchor a battleship?" The crowd laughed. The sound stung Silas more than a slap. He kept his face a mask of stone, his gaze fixed on the auctioneer. 300 going once, Henderson chanted, going twice. He paused, scanning the crowd one last time. There were no other takers, just shaking heads and amused smiles. "Sold," the gavel cracked like a gunshot. "For $300 to Silas Blackwood." A wave of murmurs washed over the room. Poor kid's lost his mind. Grief does strange things. That thing will bleed him dry before it ever moves an inch of dirt. As the crowd began to disperse, Slater made his way over to Silas, clapping him hard on the shoulder. It wasn't a friendly gesture, it was a condescending one. "Seriously, son," Slater said, his voice low and confidential, as if he were giving sage advice. "You should have saved your money. That thing's a boat anchor. You need modern equipment to make a living these days. I just signed the papers on a new 4020. Power shift, closed center hydraulics. That's the future. This," he gestured to the hulking Dozer, "is a $300 tombstone." Silas finally met his gaze. "It'll do the work I need it to do, Warren." Slater just shook his head, a sad smile on his face. "You're your father's son, all right. Stubborn, too proud to take a loan and do things the right way. Well, don't come crying to me when that pile of junk is rusting in your field and the bank is knocking on your door." He turned and walked away, the crowd parting for him like he was a king. Silas ignored them all. He walked toward his new purchase, the largest and most complicated thing he had ever owned. He ran a hand over the cold steel of the blade, the metal pitted and rough. He smelled the grease, the diesel, the faint metallic scent of decay. Everyone saw a worthless heap of scrap iron, a mistake, a folly. But Silas saw something else. He saw the reclamation of the lower 20. He saw 60 new acres of workable land, cleared of trees and stone. He saw a future. It was a long, hard, lonely road, but for the first time since his father's passing, he saw a road. But before we go any further, I have to ask you something. Have you ever looked at a piece of old machinery, a rusty tool, or anything that everyone else called junk, and seen the potential in it? That one thing you knew, deep in your bones, you could bring back to life? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your story. Getting the HD11 home was the first trial. It was too wide and too heavy for any normal trailer. Silas had to hire a specialized heavy-haul truck, a monstrous Kenworth with a lowboy trailer that cost him another $150 he couldn't afford. The driver, a grizzled man named Earl, took one look at the Dozer and spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Son, you sure you know what you're buying?" Earl asked, chewing slowly. "I do," Silas replied, his voice flat. "All right, your money." The process of loading it was a terrifying spectacle of groaning steel and shrieking hydraulics. They managed to get the Dozer's old diesel engine to cough to life, belching a volcano of thick black smoke that filled the barn and sent men scurrying for fresh air. The sound was deafening, a rattling, clattering roar that spoke of loose tolerances and worn parts. With agonizing slowness, Silas coaxed the machine up the ramps and onto the trailer, the whole rig groaning under the strain. The trip back to the Blackwood farm was a slow, funereal procession. People came out of their houses to stare at the mechanical monster crawling down the county road. Warren Slater drove past in his shiny new pickup, slowing down just long enough to shake his head in theatrical disbelief. By the time they arrived at the farm, Silas felt like the whole county had witnessed his shame. Earl unloaded the Dozer next to the old barn, the steel tracks sinking 6 inches into the soft earth. He took Silas's money, wished him luck with a tone that clearly meant, "You'll need it," and drove away, leaving Silas alone with his purchase. For the rest of that fall, and all through the brutal winter that followed, the Dozer sat. It became a monument to his supposed foolishness. Snow piled on its blade and drifted against its tracks. The neighbors, on their way to town, would slow down and point. "There's Silas's folly," they'd say. The name stuck. Silas spent that winter in the farm's unheated workshop, a place that smelled of damp earth and his father's ghost. He wasn't idle. He was studying. He'd spent his last $20 on a set of original Alice Chalmers service manuals he'd found through an ad in a farm journal. The pages were brittle and stained with the grease of long-dead mechanics. He read them by the light of a single bare bulb, memorizing diagrams of the fuel system, the hydraulic pumps, the planetary steering clutches, and the intricate, brutal design of the final drives. He learned that his Dozer's engine was a Buddha diesel, a notoriously tough but cantankerous power plant. He learned that the hydraulic system, called a cable-over hydraulic unit, was an obsolete nightmare. He learned that every single bolt on the machine was American-made, thick as his thumb, and likely rusted solid. When the first thaw of 1970 finally broke the winter's grip, Silas began. He drained the engine oil first. It came out not as a liquid, but as a thick black sludge, the consistency of tar. It told a story of years of neglect. He dropped the massive belly pan, a sheet of steel so heavy he had to use a chain hoist to lower it. A cascade of dirt, grease, and petrified leaves fell out, a nest for field mice. For a week he did nothing but clean. He scraped away decades of accumulated grime with a putty knife, a wire brush, and gallons of kerosene. He wanted to see the bare metal, to understand the machine's bones. Underneath the filth, he found hairline cracks in the welds on the track frame and a slow, persistent leak from one of the final drive seals. More problems, more work. The first major task was the engine. It ran, but it smoked horribly and had a deep rhythmic knock that suggested a serious problem. He spent 2 days just trying to get the injectors out, each one seized in the head. He fashioned a slide hammer from a piece of scrap steel and a hefty iron weight, and one by one, with a series of jarring metallic slams, he pulled them free. They were fouled beyond belief. He took the injectors and the injection pump to an old German mechanic named Klaus, who ran a small shop in the next town over. Klaus was a master of old diesels, a man who could diagnose an engine by sound and smell alone. Klaus laid the parts on his bench, examining them under a magnifying glass. "Ah, this is not good," he grunted, his accent thick. "The pump is tired, the injectors are garbage." "Where did this come from?" "An old HD-11, Silas said. Klaus looked up, his bushy white eyebrows raised. "The Buddha engine. Gott in Himmel. You are a brave man, or a foolish one." He peered at Silas over his glasses. "I can rebuild the pump. New nozzles for the injectors. It will cost you $400. Silas's stomach tightened. It was money he'd earned doing odd jobs for a neighbor, mending fences and shoveling manure. It was his seed money for the spring planting. "Do it," he said, his voice barely a whisper. While he waited for the parts, he turned his attention to the undercarriage. He used a massive wrench with a 6-foot cheetah pipe to break the track tensioner bolt. With a groan of protesting metal, the track went slack. He then had to drive out the master pin, a thick cylinder of hardened steel that held the track together. It took 2 days of heating the link with an acetylene torch until it glowed cherry red, then pounding on the pin with a 16-pound sledgehammer. Each blow was a full-bodied effort, a grunt of exertion that echoed off the barn walls. Sweat poured off him, stinging his eyes. His hands were blistered and raw. Finally, with one last desperate swing, the pin slid free. The track, a 2-ton steel belt, fell to the ground with a deafening crash. He spent the next month rebuilding the undercarriage, one side at a time. He replaced worn rollers and idlers, using the Dozer's own blade, raised and lowered with a chain hoist to lift the massive track frames. It was dangerous, back-breaking work. He learned the unique weight and balance of every part, the feel of a cross-threaded bolt, the sharp smell of cutting torch on old steel. His body ached constantly. His hands were permanently stained with grease, the dirt ground so deep into the lines of his palms that it would never wash out. The community's scorn was a constant low hum in the background of his life. When he went to the co-op for parts, the men sitting around the wood stove would stop talking and watch him. Slater was always there, holding court. "Hear you're playing blacksmith out at your place, Blackwood," Slater would call out, a grin on his face. "You gonna forge a new plow out of that old relic?" Silas would just nod, gather his parts, and leave. He had no time for them. Their words were just noise. The only things that mattered were torque specs and the proper way to seat a bearing. He was in a world of his own, a world of iron and oil and sweat. He was tearing the machine down to its soul, and in the process, he was rebuilding his own. The grain prices started to climb in the spring of '72. It began as a rumor, a whisper at the feed mill about a massive sale to the Soviet Union. At first, no one believed it. Then the numbers on the board at the grain elevator started ticking up. Corn went from $1.25 a bushel to $1.50, then $2. By the fall of '73, it was flirting with $3. For farmers who had spent their lives battling break-even prices, it was like a gold rush. The banks, smelling opportunity, opened the floodgates of credit. Suddenly, any farmer with a decent plot of land could get a loan for almost anything. The phrase on everyone's lips was fence-a-row to fence-a-row. Old pastures were ploughed under, woodlots were cleared. Every available square inch was put into production to chase the golden prices. No one rode that wave higher than Warren Slater. He was the first in the county to buy a brand-new International Harvester, 1466, a turbocharged beast of a tractor with over 140 horsepower. Its deep-throated roar could be heard a mile away as he worked his fields late into the night, its headlights cutting swaths through the darkness. He bought the 80-acre parcel next to his, outbidding 2 other farmers with a cash offer financed by the bank. He traded in his pickup for a new Ford F-250, the top-of-the-line Ranger XLT model. He broke ground on a new ranch-style house for his family, set back from the road with a long, graceful driveway. Slater became the embodiment of the new prosperity. At the diner, he'd talk loudly about land values, depreciation, and tax write-offs. He spoke of farming not as a way of life, but as a business, a growth industry. "You gotta spend money to make money," he'd declare, slapping the table for emphasis. "Leverage is the name of the game. The old ways are dead." And when he said it, he'd often glance over at Silas, sitting alone in a corner booth, nursing a cup of coffee. By then, Silas had gotten the HD-11 running. The day the rebuilt injector pump and new nozzles came back from Klaus, he'd spent hours meticulously installing them, timing the engine with a precision born of countless nights studying the manuals. He bled the fuel lines, checked every connection, and filled the radiator with fresh coolant. He climbed into the worn steel seat, took a deep breath, and hit the starter. The engine cranked, slow and heavy. It coughed once, twice, then erupted into a smooth, powerful roar. The thick black smoke was gone, replaced by a light grey haze that cleared as the engine warmed. The deep death rattle knock was gone, replaced by the healthy rhythmic clatter of a working diesel. Silas felt a surge of triumph so fierce it almost brought him to his knees. He had done it. He had breathed life back into the dead iron. But he didn't use the dozer to plant more corn. While his neighbors were plowing up every inch of land they owned, Silas took his machine to the 60-acre woodlot on the north end of his property. The piece of land everyone considered worthless. He started at the edge, lowered the massive scarred blade, and pushed. The work was brutal. The dozer groaned and strained as it uprooted 20-year-old scrub oaks, the roots popping and tearing from the earth. He hit rocks, hidden just below the surface, that sent jarring shocks through the machine and up his spine. He spent his days in a world of engine roar, screeching roots, and the grating sound of steel on stone. He worked from sunup to sundown, emerging from the woods at dusk, covered in a thick layer of dust and grime, his ears ringing. The neighbors thought he was crazier than ever. "Look at him," they'd say, watching the plume of diesel smoke rise from the woods. "Corn is $3 a bushel, and he's playing in the dirt with that old toy. He's missing the boat completely." Slater drove by one afternoon and stopped his truck, watching for a long time as Silas methodically cleared a line of stubborn brush. He just shook his head and drove off, laughing. To him and to everyone else, Silas was a failure. He was a man living in the past, a throwback to a time of small-thinking, small-doing men. He was stubbornly refusing to join the party, to get rich like the rest of them. Silas didn't care. He was paying his own way. The money he made from his modest corn and soybean crops went directly to paying down the last of his father's operating loans at the bank. He bought no new equipment. He didn't even own a television. He lived in the small, unpainted farmhouse, ate simple meals, and poured every ounce of his energy and every spare dollar into his land. Not into planting it, but into remaking it. He wasn't just clearing the land, he was shaping it. He used the dozer to dig long, gently sloping terraces into the newly cleared fields, creating a system to control erosion. He piled the thousands of field stones he unearthed into massive, neat walls along the property line. And in the low-lying swampland near the creek, the 20 acres that flooded every spring, he began the most ambitious project of all. He started digging a deep, wide drainage ditch, a massive undertaking that would take him years, designed to channel the spring meltwater away from the fertile soil and render it farmable for the first time in a generation. He was building something, not for this year or the next, but for the decades to come. He was trading the short-term gold rush for long-term stability. He owned his land, he owned his machinery, and he was slowly, painfully becoming free. But no one else could see it. They only saw the old clothes, the old tractor, and the man who was foolishly moving dirt while they were all cashing checks. One evening in the fall of '74, Silas was at the co-op, buying a new set of filters for the dozer. The radio behind the counter was on, a news report about the economy. The announcer's voice was grave. He spoke of rampant inflation, an oil embargo by a group called OPEC, and a man named Paul Volcker at the Federal Reserve who was talking about raising interest rates to break inflation's back. Slater was there, picking up a 50-pound bag of deer corn. He scoffed at the radio. "Don't listen to that nonsense," he said to the men gathered around. "They're just trying to scare people. Land is the only thing that's real. And prices are only going one way, up. I just locked in a rate for another 160 acres. The banker told me I was smart to get in now." The other men nodded in agreement. It was the new gospel. Debt was smart, expansion was everything. But as Silas paid for his filters and walked out into the cool night air, the announcer's words echoed in his mind. Interest rates, inflation. It sounded distant, like a storm happening in another country. But he'd spent enough time watching the sky to know that distant storms had a way of coming home. He looked out over the darkened fields, at the distant yard light of Slater's new house, and for the first time he felt a cold knot of dread in his stomach. The party was loud and bright, but he could hear, far off in the silence, the first faint rumbles of a terrible thunder. The good years, like a long, warm summer, couldn't last forever. The first sign of the changing season came not in the sky, but on the small television Silas kept in the corner of his kitchen. In 1979, grainy images of angry crowds and long lines at gas stations flickered across the screen. The man on the news spoke of a revolution in a country called Iran, of another oil shock. The price of diesel fuel at the co-op, which had been stable for years, jumped 10 cents a gallon, then 20. For men like Warren Slater, who ran massive, thirsty, turbocharged tractors from dawn until well past dusk, it was like a new, invisible tax on every acre. Then came the summer of 1980. It arrived hot and stayed that way. The sky turned a pale, hazy white and forgot how to make rain. The corn, which had shot up tall and green in the wet spring, began to suffer. By mid-July, the broad leaves were curling inward during the day, a desperate attempt to conserve moisture, their edges turning a sickly, papery brown. The creeks shrank, leaving muddy, cracked banks baking in the relentless sun. The whole county seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a storm that never came. Slater's new fields, the ones he'd ploughed up from old pasture land, were the first to show the strain. The thin topsoil, lacking the deep organic structure of the established fields, couldn't hold the moisture. Dust devils danced across his land, peeling away the precious soil and carrying it off into the hazy sky. Silas, watching from his own property line, saw the difference. His newly terraced fields, the ones he'd carved out of the woods with the HD-11, held the water from the spring rains like a sponge. His corn was stressed, but it was surviving, its roots driven deep into the rich, undisturbed soil he had so carefully preserved. The mechanical cracks in Slater's empire began to show that August. His massive John Deere 4640, the four-wheel drive jewel of his fleet, developed a problem in its sophisticated power shift transmission. It would shudder violently when shifting under load, a sound like grinding bones. The local dealer didn't have the tools or the training to fix it. They had to send for a specialist from the regional hub, a young man in a clean uniform who plugged in diagnostic gauges and spoke a language of hydraulic pressures and solenoid failures. The tractor sat idle for a week, a silent green giant in the middle of a dying field, waiting for a part to be shipped from Moline. The final bill was over $5,000. Slater paid it with a check that Silas knew must have stretched his operating loan to its absolute limit. A week later, Slater was at the co-op, his face grim, his usual boisterous energy gone. He was arguing with the manager over the price of a hydraulic filter. "This is robbery," Slater said, his voice tight with fury. "You people are getting rich off our misery." The manager, a patient man named Frank, just sighed. "My costs are up too, Warren. The price is the price." Silas was in the next aisle, looking for a new seal for one of the HD11's track idlers. He'd noticed a slight grease leak that morning. He found the part, a simple neoprene ring in a small cardboard box. The price was $7. He could fix it himself in an afternoon with a set of heavy wrenches and a pry bar. He paid his $7 and left, the sound of Slater's angry voice fading behind him. That fall, the harvest was a disaster. Yields across the county were down by a third. The corn was light, the cobs poorly filled out. And to add insult to injury, the grain prices, which had been the foundation of everyone's prosperity, began to slide. The Soviet grain embargo, a political move made in a distant capital, had slammed the door on a massive export market. The elevators were full and demand was plummeting. Corn that had been $3 a bushel was now struggling to fetch $2. The whispers at the diner began to change. The talk was no longer of expansion and new equipment. It was of operating notes coming due, of bankers who weren't smiling anymore. The word on everyone's lips was cash flow. Slater, who had borrowed against the promise of high yields and high prices, was caught in a vice. His costs were higher than ever, and his income had been cut in half. The cracks were no longer hidden. They were spreading across the face of his farm like the fissures in the drought-stricken earth. Silas, meanwhile, finished his own modest harvest. His yields were down too, but not as badly. He sold just enough to cover his taxes and living expenses for the year. The rest he stored in his father's old grain bins. He didn't need the cash. He had no payments to make. As the first snows of winter began to fall, Silas worked in his shop, methodically tearing down the HD11's final drives for a preventative rebuild, replacing bearings and seals. He was preparing for the next season. For Warren Slater and many others, the storm had already arrived, and there was no shelter in sight. The final blow came not from the sky or the soil, but from a piece of paper in the mail. In 1981, the Federal Reserve, in its war against inflation, let interest rates soar to levels not seen in living memory. The prime rate climbed to 15, then 18, then an unthinkable 21%. For farmers like Warren Slater, whose entire operation was built on a pyramid of variable rate loans, it was a death sentence. His operating note from the bank, the one he used to buy seed, fuel, and fertilizer, reset at the new rate. The payments ballooned overnight, becoming monstrous, unpayable things. The mortgage on the new land, the loan on the new house, the financing on the fleet of shiny equipment, they all reset, one by one, each letter from the bank, another nail in his coffin. The pressure transformed him. The confident, backslapping man was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed ghost who drove his pickup too fast and spent his evenings staring at piles of bills on the kitchen table. The laughter was gone from his new ranch house. The lights were often off by 8 o'clock. Silas saw it happen from a distance. He'd see Slater's wife at the grocery store, her face etched with worry. He'd hear the stories at the co-op, hushed and sympathetic now, about the bank manager's car being seen in Slater's driveway at odd hours. The king was falling, and his subjects could only watch in horrified silence. The foreclosure notice appeared on the door of the county courthouse in the spring of 1982. It was a simple, typewritten sheet of paper behind a glass pane, but it was the most brutal obituary imaginable. It listed, in cold, legal language, the parcels of land, the house, and the full line of equipment belonging to Warren Slater, all to be sold at public auction to satisfy the demands of the bank. The day of the auction was cold and grey, a fitting sky for a funeral. The whole county was there, Not out of spite, but out of a grim sense of obligation, like distant relatives at a wake. They stood in clusters on Slater's once manicured lawn, their hands in their pockets, their voices low. Henderson, the same auctioneer from all those years ago, was there, but his usual booming enthusiasm was gone, replaced by a somber professionalism. Slater's equipment was lined up in a neat, tragic row. The International 1466, the John Deere 4640, the gleaming silver grain trucks. They looked like museum pieces, monuments to a fallen civilization. Silas stood at the back of the crowd, just as he had at that other auction. He watched as Henderson sold off the pieces of Slater's dream. The tractors went for pennies on the dollar. The market was flooded with machinery from other failed farms, and the banks were desperate to recoup anything they could. A 4-year-old combine that Slater had paid over $100,000 for sold for $30,000. Each crack of the gavel was a body blow. Warren Slater stood on the porch of his house, watching it all unfold. He looked 10 years older. His shoulders were slumped, his face pale. He wasn't the proud man who had mocked Silas. He was a broken one. When the auctioneer finally turned to the house and the land itself, Slater turned and went inside, unable to watch anymore. Silas, meanwhile, was weathering the crisis. His farm was an island of stability in a sea of chaos. The drainage ditch he had spent 3 years digging with the HD-11 had turned the once useless 20-acre swamp into his most productive field, its deep black soil holding moisture through the driest spells. The 60 acres he'd cleared of trees and rock were now his best pasture land, supporting a small but profitable herd of beef cattle that gave him a source of income completely separate from the volatile grain markets. While his neighbors were going broke, Silas was slowly prospering. He had no debt. His fuel costs were low. The old Dozer and his father's Minneapolis Moline tractor were slow and inefficient by modern standards, but they were paid for, and he knew how to fix them with his own 2 hands. He was self-sufficient, a man standing on a foundation of solid earth and iron, not paper and promises. The neighbors, who had once called his Dozer Silas's Folly, now spoke his name with a kind of reverence. They'd stop by, hats in hand, to ask his advice about terracing a hillside or fixing an old piece of equipment. He had become, without ever intending to, the wise man of the county. The auction for Slater's land was the last item of the day. The crowd had thinned. The banker, a man in a crisp suit that looked out of place in the muddy farmyard, stood beside Henderson. "All right, folks," Henderson said, his voice tired. "Now we offer the real estate, 160 acres of prime farmland with a 3-bedroom home. Who'll start the bidding at $100,000? Silence. In the boom years, the land alone would have brought twice that. Now, with credit impossible to get and the future uncertain, no one could afford it. No one dared. $75,000, Henderson pleaded. More silence. The banker whispered something in his ear. $50,000. We have an opening bid from the bank at $50,000. Do I hear 60? The silence stretched on. It seemed the bank would simply reclaim the land, another casualty of the crisis. Then, from the back of the crowd, a hand was raised. It was Silas. Henderson's eyes widened slightly. I have 60,000 from Mr. Blackwood. 60,000. Do I hear 70? The banker, looking annoyed, nodded to Henderson. The bank bid 70. Silas raised his hand again, without hesitation. 80. The exchange went on, a quiet, tense duel between the man in the suit and the man in the canvas jacket. The crowd watched, spellbound. It was a battle of 2 worlds, the world of leveraged finance against the world of hard-earned cash. When the bidding reached $120,000, the banker conferred with his colleague, shook his head, and stepped back. 120,000 going once, Henderson chanted, his voice regaining some of its old rhythm. Going twice. Sold for $120,000 to Silas Blackwood. A quiet gasp went through the crowd. Silas Blackwood, the man they had all pitied, now owned the farm of the man they had all envied. He had paid for it in cash, with money he had saved, dollar by painful dollar, over 10 years of frugal living and relentless work. As the crowd dispersed, Silas walked toward the house. Warren Slater came out onto the porch, his face a mask of disbelief and shame. The two men stood there for a long moment, the silence thick with the weight of years of history. "You came to gloat?" Slater finally asked, his voice rough. "No," Silas said quietly. "I came to make you an offer." Slater stared at him, confused. "An offer? You own everything. There's nothing left." "The house is yours," Silas said. "You and your family can stay as long as you need. No rent. And I could use a hand running this place. It's too much for one man. I'll pay you a fair wage." Slater looked as if he'd been struck. He leaned against a porch column for support, his eyes welling with tears he refused to let fall. He looked out at the fields, at the auctioneer's truck driving away, at the end of his world. "Why, Silas?" he choked out. "After everything I said, after how I treated you." Silas looked past him, toward the north, where his own farm lay. He could just see the glint of the sun off the roof of his old barn. He thought of the Dozer, sitting silent and patient. "It's work done for the day." "Because we're neighbors, Warren," he said. "And this land is hard enough without us being hard on each other." He paused, then added, "And because you were wrong about one thing. I wasn't farming like my father, I was farming like my grandfather. He's the one who taught me that the bank can't foreclose on a paid-for tractor." Slater finally looked at him, a glimmer of understanding in his ruined eyes. "That old Dozer," he whispered. "That $300 tombstone." "It was a cornerstone," Silas corrected him gently. Life settled into a new rhythm. The 1980s were lean years for everyone, but the combined Blackwood-Slater farm survived, then stabilized. Warren, humbled and grateful, proved to be a good and tireless worker. He knew the land, and freed from the crushing weight of debt, his old love for farming returned. He never regained his former swagger, but he found something better, a quiet dignity. Silas never changed. Even as his fortunes grew, he lived simply. He never bought a new tractor, preferring to haunt farm auctions himself, buying old, well-built machines for cash and rebuilding them in his workshop. His farm became a working museum of classic iron, a Minneapolis Moline G1000, an Oliver 1850, and at the heart of it all, the Alice Chalmers HD11. He gave it a fresh coat of Persian orange paint one winter, and it sat by the barn not as a relic, but as a revered elder. Years passed. The farm crisis faded into memory, a painful lesson etched into the history of the heartland. By the late 90s, Silas was a man in his 50s, his face a roadmap of his life's work, his hands thick and calloused, but immensely capable. He had a son of his own now, a boy named David, who grew up in the shadow of the old Dozer. One Saturday afternoon, David, now 16, was helping Silas in the shop. They were adjusting the tracks on the HD11. "Dad," David asked, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "Why do we keep this old thing? We could afford a new one, a new cat with a cab and air conditioning and a radio." Silas stopped turning the massive wrench and looked at his son. He walked over to the Dozer and laid a hand on its still warm engine cowling. "This machine teaches you things a new one can't," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "It teaches you that nothing comes easy. You want to move dirt, you have to feel the strain of it in your bones. You want it to run, you have to understand every bolt and every grease fitting. You have to listen to its language." He looked out the open shop door, across his sprawling, prosperous fields, a patchwork of green and gold stretching to the horizon. He saw the gentle curves of the terraces he had carved, the straight, clean line of the drainage ditch, the neat stone walls he had built. He saw Warren Slater, now a grey-haired man, driving the old Minneapolis Moline, cultivating a field that was once his own, now part of theirs. "This Dozer," Silas continued, his gaze returning to the boy, "is more than just iron, David. It's a lesson. It's the difference between being a borrower and being a builder. It's about owning your work, owning your land, owning yourself. Everyone in the world will try to sell you something new and easy and financed. They'll tell you debt is smart, they'll tell you the old ways are foolish. But this land doesn't care about any of that. It only rewards patience and hard work. It only remembers what you build to last." He handed the heavy wrench to his son. "Now, put your back into it. This old girl has a few more fences to push." David took the wrench, its weight familiar and reassuring in his hands. He looked from his father's steady eyes to the immense, scarred blade of the old tractor. For the first time, he didn't see a piece of junk or a relic. He saw a legacy. He saw the 10-ton cornerstone of everything he had ever known, silent and solid, its engine ready, waiting for the work of the next generation.